The following story is based on the real case of Hallie Cummings from 2009 in Florida, USA. Let us know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. There are few sounds as haunting as the silence that follows a child's laughter. On the night of February 9, 2009, in the sweltering quiet of a trailer home in Satsuma, Florida, that silence fell heavy and thick, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. 5-year-old Hallie Cummings, a spirited, bright-eyed little girl with blonde hair and a boundless love for her stuffed animals, simply vanished. No signs of forced entry, no screams, no broken windows, just an empty bed, a missing child, and a nightmare that has never ended. Imagine tucking your child into bed, hearing their soft goodnight, watching them drift into dreams, and then waking to find nothing but cold sheets. For Hallie's father, Ronald Cummings, and his then-girlfriend Misty Crosland, this was the reality they woke up to. Or at least, that's the story they told. But from the very beginning, nothing added up. What started as a desperate search spiraled into a dizzying swirl of contradictions, shifting timelines, emotional breakdowns, and a growing sense that someone, somewhere, was hiding a terrible truth. The 911 call came at 3:27 a.m., Misty's voice trembling as she claimed she had just discovered Hallie missing. "I just woke up and our back door was wide open," she said. But when investigators arrived, they were struck not by signs of panic, but by a strange calm. There were no signs of a break-in, no disturbances. Hallie's beloved pink blanket was still crumpled on her bed, her toothbrush untouched, her school clothes laid out, ready for the next day. Everything in place, except for Hallie. And then came the inconsistencies. Misty claimed she had gone to bed around 10 p.m., that she had checked on Hallie during the night. But investigators quickly began to doubt her. Her timeline changed. Her stories wavered. She became emotional, then cold, then detached. And Ronald, grieving, angry, desperate, began to unravel publicly. "She was my baby girl," he sobbed in front of cameras. "Somebody took my baby." But the more he spoke, the more attention turned inward, not just to Misty but to Ronald himself. Their volatile relationship, their troubled past, their connection to drugs. Every layer investigators peeled back exposed something darker, something more disturbing. The case exploded in the media. News vans flooded Satsuma. Reporters camped outside the trailer home. Candlelight vigils were held. Prayer circles formed. America watched in horror and disbelief. How could a child vanish from her own bed in the middle of the night, with no trace, no clue, no witness? Was it a kidnapping, an accident, or something far worse, buried beneath a web of lies? But even as the days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, the search for Hallie never stopped. Her photo, wide smile, bow in her hair, became a symbol of stolen innocence. Her story gripped the nation, not just because of the mystery, but because of the aching hole she left behind. A girl who loved Disney movies, who twirled in her princess dress, who once danced in the Florida sunshine. Gone, without a whisper, and as the investigation deepened, a disturbing question began to form. Was the truth being hidden in plain sight? As the days ticked by, investigators dug deeper into the chaotic world that surrounded little Hallie Cummings. What they found wasn't just troubling. It was a perfect storm of dysfunction, secrets, and volatility. The mobile home in Satsuma wasn't a place of peace. It was a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Ronald Cummings, barely in his mid-20s, was known to law enforcement. So was Misty Crosland, the 17-year-old girlfriend who had been left in charge of 2 small children that night, Hallie and her younger brother, Junior. What began as a missing persons case soon transformed into something far more sinister. Misty's account of the night Hallie disappeared shifted constantly. First, she said she was asleep all night. Then she remembered waking up to get a drink of water. Later, she recalled seeing Hallie at 3 a.m. and just moments before noticing the back door ajar. Her stories twisted and turned with every interview, every police interrogation. And behind each version, investigators sensed something deeper. Not just forgetfulness, but deception. The inconsistencies were maddening. According to Misty, she had turned off the television, locked the door, and ensured both children were sleeping soundly. But law enforcement believed she wasn't even at the house for part of that night. Rumors surfaced that Misty had been out, partying with friends, possibly even using drugs, and that someone else had access to the trailer during that time. Yet, every lead hit a dead end. No fingerprints, no footprints, no credible witnesses. Just silence, thick and impenetrable. Meanwhile, Ronald projected the image of a devastated father. His emotional pleas were raw, filled with anger and desperation. He appeared frequently on television, begging for Hallie's return. But behind the cameras, a different picture began to emerge. His home life had been turbulent, marked by arrests, domestic disputes, and a revolving door of unstable relationships. Hallie's biological mother, Crystal Sheffield, was locked in a bitter custody battle with Ronald. She too had a troubled past, including allegations of drug use, which had led to Ronald gaining primary custody. The media seized on the drama. The case wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. It was a real-life soap opera. Talk shows dissected every development. Experts speculated on the psychology of each player. News anchors hinted at darker theories. Was Hallie the victim of revenge? A pawn in a feud? Or collateral damage in a drug-fueled world where children were overlooked and left behind? Law enforcement pressed hard. Both Misty and Ronald were questioned repeatedly. They were even subjected to polygraph tests. Misty reportedly failed, several times. But she held firm, denying involvement, insisting she had nothing to do with Hallie's disappearance. Still, investigators believed she knew more than she was saying. They began to theorize that Hallie might have died accidentally, possibly from neglect or worse, and that the adults involved had conspired to cover it up. But without a body, without physical evidence, everything was speculation. Leads poured in, but none panned out. Tips came from psychics, prison inmates, and so-called witnesses hoping for attention. Every effort to find Hallie, every search through swamps, abandoned buildings, and rural back roads ended the same way, empty-handed. As pressure mounted, Misty's composure began to crack. In audio recordings from jail, she sounded paranoid, erratic, distraught. At times, she hinted at knowing more than she let on. At others, she lashed out, blaming Ronald, the media, the police. And through it all, Hallie remained missing. A phantom presence in the lives of those who claimed to love her, yet couldn't, or wouldn't, tell the truth. One question loomed larger than ever. What happened inside that trailer, the night of February 9, 2009? And who was lying to keep the secret buried? By spring of 2009, the case of Hallie Cummings had already turned from a local tragedy into a national obsession. But behind the endless media appearances and emotional pleas, the true story was growing darker and more tangled than anyone could have imagined. Law enforcement knew they were not just chasing a missing child. They were unraveling a dense, suffocating web of lies, manipulation, and hidden truths. At the center of this web was Misty Crosland. Young, overwhelmed, and increasingly unstable, Misty had become the focal point of the investigation. Detectives believed she was the last person to see Hallie alive. Yet her behavior was anything but consistent. Sometimes tearful, sometimes defiant, she painted herself as both a victim and a scapegoat. But as her interviews piled up, her credibility eroded. Time after time, Misty failed polygraphs. Her answers changed subtly, then drastically. She couldn't remember key details then suddenly recalled fragments that contradicted everything she had said before. Authorities began to suspect that Misty wasn't acting alone, that others in her orbit might be hiding critical information. They looked closer at her brother, Tommy Crosland. At one point, Tommy claimed he had gone to the trailer that night, knocked on the door, and left. But then he changed his story. He hinted that something terrible had happened, something he couldn't talk about. And then there was Joe Overstreet, a cousin from Tennessee who had been visiting the family at the time. Misty would later allege, in shifting accounts, that Joe had come to the trailer that night looking for a stolen gun, and that, in a rage, he may have taken Hallie. But every new story only deepened the confusion. Was Misty covering for someone? Was she protecting herself? Or was she constructing a fiction so complex even she no longer knew the truth? Desperation led investigators down increasingly bizarre paths. They brought in cadaver dogs. They drained nearby ponds. They excavated yards and examined trash dumps. They even turned to jailhouse informants. In 2010, the case took another shocking turn. Misty Crosland, Ronald Cummings, and several others were arrested. Not for Hallie's disappearance, but for a drug trafficking operation involving prescription pills. Incredibly, while under surveillance, the couple had been recorded dealing narcotics across county lines. The arrests weren't directly tied to the case, but investigators hoped the pressure would crack someone. They wanted a confession, a slip-up, a clue. Ronald was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Misty received 25. It was a brutal collapse for two people who had once stood before cameras as grieving guardians. Now they were convicted felons. And yet, even behind bars, the truth remained elusive. Misty hinted again that she knew what had happened to Hallie. She cried in interviews, saying, "I love that little girl." But her version of events continued to change. One day she said she had seen Hallie alive. The next, she suggested she had been taken. Then silence. The longer the case stretched, the more fractured the story became. Friendships turned into betrayals. Family members accused each other. Crystal Sheffield, Hallie's biological mother, went on national TV, insisting that Misty was guilty, that she had always suspected her. "She knows what happened," Crystal said through tears. "She's just too cowardly to tell." But Misty wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Tommy Crosland, too, would later claim knowledge of Hallie's fate, though his account, like Misty's, shifted with time. He said that Joe Overstreet had killed the girl and dumped her body in the river. But searches of the St. Johns River turned up nothing. No remains, no proof. Just another ghost story in a case already drowning in contradictions. The public began to lose hope. The media moved on. But for those closest to the case, the silence grew more unbearable with each passing day. The trailer where it all began stood empty, stained with suspicion. Hallie's pink bedroom, her toys, her clothes, her dreams, frozen in time. And still, the question pulsed through every broken version of the truth. If they didn't kill her, why did they all act like they had something to hide? The deeper investigators dug into the night of February 9th, the more it seemed like the world had swallowed Hallie Cummings whole. As if she had stepped off the edge of existence and into a place where logic, evidence, and reason could not reach. Despite hundreds of tips and multiple suspects, not a single piece of forensic evidence ever surfaced. No clothing, no DNA, no fingerprints, no body. It was as if Hallie had evaporated into thin air, and the silence around her absence was deafening. This is where the case began to teeter on the edge of madness. Investigators weren't chasing facts anymore. They were chasing ghosts, confessions in whispers, and riddles told through the bars of jail cells. With Ronald and Misty now both incarcerated for unrelated crimes, detectives hoped prison time would loosen lips. And it did. But what spilled out were half-truths, contradictory stories, and confessions so warped they raised more questions than answers. Tommy Crosland, Misty's brother, gave the most damning account yet. In a chilling jailhouse letter, he claimed he had been present the night Hallie died. According to him, it wasn't a kidnapping. It was a punishment gone wrong. He said Joe Overstreet, enraged over a stolen firearm, had intended to scare Ronald by taking something precious, Hallie. When the girl screamed, things got out of control. Tommy alleged that Joe choked her out, and that together they disposed of the body in the cold, black waters of the St. Johns River. It was a story almost too grim to imagine, and yet it aligned with small fragments Misty had let slip over the years. But it also raised a haunting contradiction. If they knew what happened, why hadn't they come forward sooner? And if they were lying, why create a story so dark, so specific, and so terrifying? The authorities acted. Divers were sent to the river. Boats combed the water. Sonar scanned the muddy bottom. But nothing was ever found. Not a bone, not a piece of clothing, nothing. And without physical proof, Tommy's confession was little more than an echo in the dark. Joe Overstreet, questioned repeatedly, denied everything. He passed a polygraph. His story never wavered, and legally, there was nothing that tied him to Hallie's disappearance. Nothing solid, nothing real. But the damage was already done. The Crosland family had imploded. Accusations flew in every direction. In one surreal moment, Misty accused Tommy of lying to get revenge. Tommy claimed Misty had orchestrated everything. Their father, Hank Crosland Sr., and publicly begged for the truth, sobbing in interviews, breaking under the weight of what his children might have done. The family, once marginally functional, had shattered completely. As the years passed, law enforcement began to shift their approach. The case, though still officially open, drifted into the realm of cold cases. Public interest waned. Vigils became smaller, quieter. Hallie's name still echoed in her hometown, but the urgency had faded. The girl whose face once lit up screens across America had become a memory, still smiling in missing person posters, still 5 years old, frozen in time. For Crystal Sheffield, Hallie's mother, the pain never dulled. She clung to the belief that someone, Misty, Ronald, someone, knew the truth. She appeared on television less frequently now, but when she did, her message was always the same. Tell me where my daughter is. Let me bring her home. And then came the final, crushing realization. It was entirely possible that Hallie Cummings was never coming back, and that no one would ever pay the price for what happened. What happens to justice when the trail runs cold, and everyone left behind is either silent, dead, or in prison? When a child disappears, it doesn't just fracture a family. It fractures a community. And in the years following Hallie Cummings' disappearance, the small rural town of Satsuma, Florida, remained in a strange state of suspended grief. Billboards with her face became part of the landscape. Neighbors who once waved over fences now eyed each other with suspicion. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had someone to blame. And everyone, in some small way, felt the unease that came with knowing a child had vanished in their own backyard. And no one could explain how. The law enforcement community, too, carried the weight. Dozens of deputies, detectives, search crews, and federal agents had devoted thousands of hours to finding Hallie. Some had walked miles through dense Florida swampland. Others had followed up on tips from halfway across the country. They had sifted through trash, crawled through crawl spaces, and chased ghosts through abandoned buildings. And yet, every lead brought them back to the same place. Nowhere. Captain Dominic Pisatello of the Putnam County Sheriff's Office would later say the case haunted him. "We were so close, so many times," he admitted. "But every time we thought we had something, it unraveled." The emotional toll on the department was immense. Officers burned out, turnover increased, and a sense of failure hung in the air. They weren't just fighting against time. They were fighting against a conspiracy of silence. And while the justice system had succeeded in locking up several of the central figures on unrelated charges, there was no satisfaction. Misty Crosland, the teenager who had once babysat Hallie, then became the most scrutinized woman in America, was now serving a 25-year sentence. In prison interviews, she looked like a ghost of her former self. Pale, jittery, eyes darting. She continued to claim innocence in Haley's disappearance. "I didn't hurt her. I would never hurt her," she said in one recorded interview. "But nobody believes me." Ronald Cummings, also in prison, took a different tone. He wavered between grief and fury. Sometimes he defended Misty. Other times, he lashed out at her. He gave interviews laced with contradictions, hinting at knowledge he refused to explain. "If I knew who did it, they'd be dead," he once told a reporter. It was hard to tell if his rage was rooted in truth or in guilt. Haley's little brother, Ronald Jr., was only 3 years old when she vanished. Too young to fully understand what happened, yet old enough to carry the imprint of that night forever. Over time, he was removed from the environment of chaos and raised away from the public eye. As he grew older, questions would inevitably follow. Where is your sister? What happened that night? And worst of all, did you see something back then that no one listened to? The community struggled to move on. For years, candlelight vigils were held on the anniversary of Hallie's disappearance. Volunteers lit lanterns, released balloons, and whispered prayers into the night sky. But each year, fewer people came. The hope that had once burned so brightly began to flicker. New cases arose. New tragedies replaced old ones in the news cycle. And Hallie's name, once a daily headline, began to fade into memory. But for her family, fractured though it was, the pain remained fresh. Crystal Sheffield never gave up hope entirely. She still believed someone would talk, that guilt would crack open the truth. "I just want to bring her home," she repeated like a mantra in every interview, her voice growing quieter with each passing year. Her grief aged her. Her words became slower, more measured, like someone talking through a dream they couldn't escape. "Because how do you grieve for a child when you don't know if she's alive or dead? When there's no grave to visit, no truth to hold on to? When the last thing you remember is her tiny hand waving goodbye, and the next moment, she's gone." And so the story of Hallie Cummings became something more than a case. It became a wound, one that never closed, one that kept bleeding, silently, into the lives of everyone it touched. As the years pressed on, what remained in the wake of Hallie Cummings' disappearance wasn't just mystery. It was an unbearable silence, the kind of silence that corrodes from the inside out. People stopped asking out loud what happened, but the question never left the air. It hung there like fog, thick, unavoidable, and quietly suffocating. The silence became its own kind of evidence. Because someone always knows something, law enforcement continued to quietly review the case, even as public attention drifted. Files were reopened, timelines reanalyzed, recordings replayed. Investigators looked for inconsistencies they may have missed the first time. Subtle slips in language, inflections of guilt buried inside emotional appeals. They returned to old interviews, particularly Misty's. One moment stood out. A question about what Hallie had been wearing the night she disappeared. Misty answered quickly, too quickly, describing a pink shirt with a specific design. But there was a problem. That shirt had been found in the laundry hamper, suggesting it had been worn earlier, not that night. It was a detail too exact to be mistaken, or maybe too rehearsed to be trusted. It was this kind of detail that fueled renewed suspicion, not just toward Misty, but toward everyone in that house, and beyond. Crystal Sheffield, desperate for answers, hired private investigators to conduct their own interviews. One former FBI profiler reviewed the case and publicly stated his belief. Hallie likely died in that trailer, and the adults involved had orchestrated a cover-up. It was not a conclusion born of evidence, but of patterns, behavior, the kind of thing you sense rather than prove. Then came the jailhouse letters. Over the years, Misty, Tommy, and other family members sent dozens of notes from behind bars, some to each other, some to the media. In one, Tommy apologized for not telling the full truth. In another, Misty asked her grandmother to believe in her innocence, writing, "They all turned on me, but I'm not the monster they think I am." The letters were full of contradictions. Some suggested guilt, others claimed ignorance. All were tainted with desperation, and always, the shadow of Joe Overstreet loomed. Despite being the alleged killer in several versions of the story, Overstreet remained a free man. Law enforcement had no evidence linking him to a crime. He had cooperated. He had passed polygraphs. He had an alibi, according to family members. And yet, to many, he remained the story's final dark thread, the unnamed fear at the edge of every confession. But even more troubling was this. The people most connected to the night Hallie vanished were growing up, or growing older, in prison. And with each passing year, the odds of them finally telling the truth shrank. Not because they forgot, but because the consequences of telling the truth had grown too large. If there had been an accident, they would face murder charges. If there had been a cover-up, multiple lives would unravel. In a world where fear and shame ruled, silence was safer. And so the story calcified. A missing girl, a trailer in the night, a 911 call, a media circus, and then nothing. The trail of truth was buried beneath a decade of lies, arrests, heartbreak, and dead ends. Still, there were those who held on, not to justice, but to memory. Teachers who remembered Hallie's laugh in the classroom. Neighbors who remembered her playing barefoot in the yard. Even strangers, moved by her photo, still kept her picture pinned to corkboards and refrigerator doors. As long as her face was visible, the story wasn't over. There was still a chance, however impossible, that she might be found. But beneath the hope was a grim possibility no one wanted to face. That the only people who ever knew what happened to Hallie had already buried the truth alongside her. By 2015, the case of Hallie Cummings had crossed a tragic milestone. 6 years missing, with no answers, no arrests, and no trace of the child at the center of the storm. It had become a cold case in every official sense, but not in the hearts of those it haunted. For the Cummings and Crosland families, for investigators, for a fractured community, Haley's name still burned like a wound that refused to heal. And yet, it seemed everyone involved had paid a price, even if not the one demanded by justice. Misty Crosland, once the teenager accused by a nation, was now a woman in her 20s behind bars. Her youthful defiance had faded into something harder to read. Numbness, maybe. She was no longer the key witness, the babysitter, or the girl under the spotlight. She was inmate J51524. And as the years passed, Misty started doing something unexpected, withdrawing. She refused interviews. She stopped talking to the media. Even family contact became limited. Whether it was guilt, trauma, or simple exhaustion, Misty had gone quiet. Ronald Cummings, locked away in his own cell across the state, was much the same. His letters from prison became less frequent, his interviews less explosive. The bravado was gone. He began to speak more about regret, not always about Hallie directly, but about the life choices that led him here. His voice, once filled with rage and denial, now carried the weight of someone who had lost everything and knew it. But justice was still missing. Tommy Crosland, also in prison, remained the last person to offer a potential version of the truth. But even his account had begun to erode. At one point, he insisted Joe Overstreet had killed Hallie. Later, he hinted at other names. The details blurred, flipped, and decayed. Each retelling left more questions than answers. Law enforcement could not act without evidence. And without a body, a witness, or a confession that held up, they were trapped in a limbo of possibilities. The public, too, was caught in that limbo. Internet forums dissected every development, every prison transcript, every rumor. Amateur sleuths created timelines, diagrams, and digital reconstructions of the trailer layout. But nothing stuck. Theories clashed, facts were debated. And through it all, one chilling reality lingered. The only people who could answer what happened were the ones who had lied too many times to ever be believed. Meanwhile, Haley's mother, Crystal Sheffield, remained a voice in the wilderness. Her grief had evolved into a quiet, steady pain. No longer front-page news, but a daily presence in her life. She rarely gave interviews now, but when she did, her words had changed. They weren't about arrests or blame. They were about closure. "I just want to know," she would say. Even if the answer is bad, even if it's the worst thing. That need for closure resonated with everyone who had followed the case. Even seasoned detectives, hardened by years of work, admitted that Haley's file never stopped haunting them. One retired investigator described it as, "the one case that broke me." Because there's a particular kind of helplessness that comes from knowing what likely happened and being unable to prove it. In 2019, a decade after her disappearance, vigils were still held. A memorial tree was planted in her honor. A scholarship was created in her name. But the sorrow was palpable. The signs were fading. The posters were gone. Time, merciless and unbending, was closing in. And yet every now and then a tip would come in. A claimed sighting. A memory resurfaced. A whisper from a prison cell. And each time, investigators had to ask themselves the same question. What if this is it? What if this is the moment we've been waiting for? And every time, it wasn't. Time does something cruel to unsolved tragedies. It doesn't just dull memories, it distorts them. Faces blur. Voices become guesses. Details once sharp, like broken glass, round off into speculation. And in the case of Haley Cummings, what remained after 10 years wasn't clarity. It was erosion. The erosion of hope, of evidence, of truth. By 2020, the case file had ballooned into thousands of pages. A monument of dead ends. Tips from inmates hoping to barter for lighter sentences. Claims from psychics. Dozens of supposed sightings that led to nothing. Officers who had worked the case from the beginning had either retired or moved on. Those who stayed did so with quiet persistence, knowing the odds, and refusing to abandon them. Because every once in a while, a cold case catches fire, and Haley's name still had the power to ignite something in the hearts of those who remembered. But among the public, belief had started to splinter. There were those who still held out hope. People who believed Haley was alive, perhaps raised under a different identity, tucked away in a place where no one had thought to look. Others clung to the idea that her body had been hidden too well, deep in the swamps, or beneath water that would never give up its dead. And then there were those who believed the saddest possibility, that Haley had been failed in life and in death by everyone who should have protected her. Social media became a battlefield for these beliefs. True crime podcasts revisited the case, drawing in younger audiences who hadn't even been born when Haley vanished. Theories were rehashed. Digital sleuths cross-referenced phone records, jailhouse confessions, court transcripts. Some reached out to the Cummings and Crosland families for new statements. Most were ignored. Too much had been said. Too little had ever been proven. What everyone agreed on, though, was this. Something terrible had happened in that trailer. Whether it was an accident, a cover-up, or something worse, there was a collective sense that Haley hadn't simply vanished. The people involved knew more than they had told. Maybe not all the truth, maybe not the same version of it, but enough to stop the bleeding of this mystery if they had chosen to. And they didn't. At the heart of the investigation remained a tragic paradox. Law enforcement had too much information, and not enough. Too many conflicting stories, too many liars, too many people who had every reason to protect themselves instead of the child who depended on them. And yet, that didn't mean they had given up. In 2021, a cold case task force revisited Haley's file. They used advanced forensic software to reanalyze old recordings. They reprocessed digital evidence. They interviewed former inmates who had once been dismissed. And they found nothing new. At least nothing they could act on. But even the effort meant something. It signaled that Haley's story hadn't been shelved. Not completely. Sometimes families in these cases say the worst pain is not knowing, not death, not loss, but the permanent suspension of answers. The way a missing person's story becomes stuck in time, their room untouched, their photos forever frozen in the last moment they were seen. For Crystal, for Ronald, for even Misty, the punishment wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. Whether guilty or not, they were all trapped in the shadow of that night. Their lives became monuments to a moment that refused to die. And so the story remained, unfinished. A 5-year-old girl, last seen in a pink shirt, her blanket beside her, in a trailer now long abandoned. A night that should have ended in dreams, not disappearance. And a question that echoed louder with each passing year. How can a child simply vanish? And no one, not one person, speak the truth? The trailer in Satsuma, Florida, where Haley Cummings disappeared, is no longer standing. Years after the investigation dwindled and media attention faded, the structure was condemned and eventually torn down. Grass grew over the plot. The lot sits empty now, quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of children playing in other yards. Children who, like Haley, once ran barefoot in the sun, but who got to grow up. But to the people who lived through that winter of 2009, the trailer never really disappeared. It lived on in memory, in nightmares, in photographs taken by investigators that remain sealed in boxes. The bedroom where she slept, the hallway Misty claimed she walked down, the back door left eerily ajar. These images became burned into the minds of detectives, journalists, and anyone who ever saw the case unfold. For some, the trailer represented a crime scene. For others, a grave. In 2022, a small group of retired officers who had worked the case began meeting informally. They weren't officially reopening the investigation. They couldn't. But something about the unresolved pain lingered too strongly. They believed that someone, somewhere, still knew something, and that maybe, just maybe, enough time had passed for a guilty conscience to break. They reviewed the timeline again. They revisited the 911 call. They noted the emotional detachment in Misty's tone, the vague responses. It wasn't damning, but it was haunting. One theory began to solidify, shared quietly among them. Haley had likely died that night in the trailer, not by a stranger, but by someone inside. Maybe it was accidental. Maybe it was out of neglect or recklessness. And then came the lie, the panic, the cover-up. The silence that followed was not just out of fear of prison. It was a silence born from shared guilt. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because if one spoke, the others would fall. This theory wasn't new. It had been considered from the beginning. But now, over a decade later, it held even more weight. Because everyone who might have been involved had something in common. None of them had built anything better since. Their lives had collapsed. Incarceration, isolation, mental illness, addiction. The kind of slow, inevitable punishment that life itself seems to deliver when the law cannot. Even Misty, the girl at the heart of it all, was no longer a person in the story, but a cautionary tale. In prison, she reportedly struggled with mental health, remained isolated, and had few visitors. Her early interviews, replayed over the years, became more tragic than suspicious. A teenager, barely functional, placed in a pressure cooker and expected to hold her story straight. Whether guilty or not, she had become a symbol of a system, a life, spiraling out of control. The question no one wanted to ask out loud anymore was the one that had always loomed. What if Hallie never left the house? What if the answer had been locked inside four walls all along? Some believe Hallie may still be found. Her remains in a forgotten patch of Florida swamp, or a place no one has thought to search. Others believe we will never find her, that the night took her, and the lies that followed buried her deeper than any river or forest ever could. But what remains, more than any theory or confession, is the ache. The psychic weight of a story unfinished, a name never cleared, a life never mourned properly. A girl who should have been graduating middle school, posting selfies, learning to drive. Instead, she is still 5, still missing, still waiting to come home, or to be laid to rest. Hallie Cummings has been missing for over 16 years. In the span of that silence, entire generations have grown up. New tragedies have claimed headlines, and Florida's humid nights have rolled endlessly on. But somewhere, beneath all the noise and the passing of time, her name still echoes. Not loudly, not constantly, but persistently, quietly, like a whisper that refuses to be silenced. She is one of the thousands of children who vanish every year, but her story, like too many others, is tangled not just in mystery, but in failure. Failure of the people who should have protected her, failure of the systems that should have intervened sooner, and failure of a justice process unable to resolve what went so horribly wrong that night in February 2009. The truth, whatever it is, remains locked away in the minds of a few. Perhaps it was never told in full. Perhaps it was fragmented and buried even within those who lived it. Trauma does that. So does guilt. The people closest to Hallie that night have spent the years not just in prison cells, but in emotional exile. Some blame each other. Others withdraw completely. None have healed. And the rest of the world? The world moved on because it had to. But not everyone forgot. In a quiet office in Putnam County, a thick file labeled Cummings Hallie still sits on a shelf. It's pulled down occasionally by investigators who refuse to let the story die completely. New technology brings fresh hope every now and then. Enhanced video analysis, new forensic testing, psychological reprofiling. But so far, it has all led back to the same place. Darkness, emptiness, silence. There are no suspects facing trial, no charges filed, no breakthrough tip, no body. There is only a single photo that refuses to age. A smiling 5-year-old girl with blonde hair, eyes too bright for the world she was born into, and a future stolen before she even had a chance to understand the dangers around her. Sometimes, the worst monsters aren't strangers in the dark. They're the people we already let inside. The ones we trust. The ones who are supposed to love and protect us. If the unthinkable happened to Hallie that night, it likely came not from some unknown predator, but from the familiar. And that's what makes this case so unbearable to confront. Because the real horror isn't just what might have happened. It's that we'll probably never know. That the answers are forever suspended in that narrow trailer, in that broken timeline, in that 3:27 a.m. phone call. So what do we do with a story like this? We remember. We speak her name. We tell the truth about what happened, or what didn't. We hold systems accountable. We treat every child's life as sacred, and every unexplained silence as a scream for justice. Hallie Cummings may never come home. She may never be found. But her story can still be heard. Her memory can still ripple. And maybe, just maybe, the fear and failure left in her wake can stop another child from being swallowed by the dark. Because even where the light never reaches, we look, we wait, we never forget.